Pastor Ed here with our weekly devotion for Wednesday, March the 25th, 2026. We're using as the text the passage that we had our gospel reading from this past Sunday, John 19 verses 1 through 16, continuing the story of Jesus and Pilate, the encounter between the two of them. Anyway, the first real job I ever had, and by real job I mean that they actually paid me, was as a stock boy at the Steinbach department store on Route 9 up in Manalapan. It's no longer there, of course. I think it's a P.C. Richards now. Back in the day, however, Steinbach's was the anchor store of the Manalapan Mall, which also no longer exists. Anyway, how I got the job is sort of interesting, though. I was still in high school at the time, and it was the fall, and Steinbach's was gearing up and hiring additional workers for the holiday season that was upcoming, and which meant that there were definitely jobs to be had. On the other hand, there were probably a dozen or more applicants for each position being offered, maybe even dozens. So the odds of getting a job were probably somewhere between slim and none. But nevertheless, I tried anyway. So I did my part by filling out the application and going in for the interview. And the store did their part as well. Someone from Human Resources, I'm assuming that was her position, sat down and went over the application with me, describing to me what kinds of jobs they had available, also what type of workers they were looking for. You know the drill: hardworking, dependable, trustworthy, and so forth. Of course, I said I was all of those things. And then her boss, the manager, later reviewed the interview results, I'm sure, and made the final decisions on hiring. Well, I thought that the interview went pretty well, about as well as could be expected, but I wasn't holding my breath when I left that day, given the fact that they had so many other applicants and therefore could be very picky and choosy about whom they hired. And I wasn't all that certain that there was anything particularly outstanding about me that came out in the interview, which would have set me apart from everyone else who was being interviewed at the same time. After all, it was my very first interview, and I was understandably a little nervous. But lo and behold, just a few days later, I got a phone call informing me that I had indeed been hired. Now, maybe I had done better on the interview than I originally felt I had. At least that's the first thought that ran through my head. And needless to say, I was feeling pretty good about myself at the moment. Of course, I was still assuming at this point that my hiring was a function of me doing my part in applying, and the store doing their part in interviewing and then evaluating me. But the truth, as it turns out, was not quite so clear-cut. You see, it seems that one of the executive secretaries who worked in the office had a child in Hope Christian School at the time, where my mom, of course, was the founding and lead teacher. And so apparently when my mom casually mentioned to her that I had applied for a job at the store, well, this woman went to work the next day, immediately took my application from the bottom of the stack of applications and placed it at the very top. And that's basically how I got the job. Of course, I learned several valuable lessons that day. First, it helps to know people. Second, that a lot of things that go on in the world happen because someone pulled some strings to make it happen. And finally, third, that sometimes, maybe a lot of the time, the people who think that they're in control of a situation really aren't in control at all. You see, I'm sure that the human resources person, as well as the manager who made the final decision hiring me, thought that they were in control, that they had the power to hire as well as fire if need be. But in this instance, at least, that wasn't exactly the truth, was it? Someone else had intervened on my behalf, of course, and tipped the scales in my favor. And someone else was the one who truly had the power in the situation when you think about it. Now, I tell you this story because in today's gospel reading, we also have a situation in which the people who thought they had the power really didn't, as it turns out. And the one who seemingly was powerless was actually the one completely in control. In the events leading up to today's reading, of course, the religious leaders had been pulling all kinds of strings, mostly behind the scenes, mind you, and had been plotting and planning and conspiring for quite some time to put Jesus to death. He was clearly a threat to them. Back in chapter 11 of the Gospel of John, in fact, in the immediate aftermath of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, the chief priests and Pharisees were becoming a little alarmed. What are we to do, they asked. This man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation. But Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year, as we heard last week, made the case that Jesus had to die. He said to them, "You know nothing at all. You do not understand that it's better for you to have one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed." And so from that day on, says John, they planned to put him, Jesus, to death. And now, as we heard in today's reading, they're about to get their wish, aren't they? And so that's why they chose to bring him before Pilate, to have the Roman governor impose the death penalty on Jesus, a death penalty that would be carried out by the most gruesome form of execution available at the time, crucifixion. As we heard, however, Pilate, for his part, doesn't seem too anxious to assist in their plan or to comply with their wishes. Instead, he's actually inclined to let Jesus off the hook. But the religious leaders are insistent. They refuse to give in or give up. "Crucify him," they keep shouting. And when Pilate urges them to take him themselves, because he can find no case against them, they raise the stakes a bit by arguing that Jesus has violated their law by claiming to be the Son of God. So he questions Jesus again. In an attempt to reassert his control, he asks Jesus, "Don't you know that I have the power to release you and also the power to crucify you?" See, it's a question of power, isn't it? Of who's really in control here. Now, the Jewish leaders think that they are, of course, the ones pulling the strings and on the verge of getting Pilate to do their dirty work for them. Whereas Pilate is the one who has the power of Rome, the entire empire behind him. And so one would naturally think that he's in control, or at least should be. Once again, he tries to release Jesus. But the religious leaders raise the stakes even higher by claiming that if he were to in fact release Jesus, Pilate himself could be accused of being no friend of the emperor. Because as they say to him, if everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against the emperor. Well, Pilate responds by trotting Jesus out again and saying, "Here's your king," only to hear in response, away with him, crucify him." One last time, Pilate asks, "Shall I crucify your king?" And one gets the feeling that Pilate is doing his very best to let Jesus off the hook. But the chief priests immediately answer, "We have no king but the emperor." And so a reluctant Pilate then finally hands Jesus over to be crucified. But now we need to come back to that question of power and control. Who really is in control here? Who truly has the power? The chief priests were clearly successful in forcing their desired outcome, that of Pilate ordering Jesus to be crucified. So are they the ones with the power, the ones in command here? Or is it Pilate, the only one who can legally issue the orders for Jesus' death by crucifixion, and moreover, has the power of the entire Roman Empire to back him up? Or is it neither of the two? As we heard, when Pilate tried to frighten or at least intimidate Jesus by saying, "Do you not know that I have the power to release you and the power to crucify you?" Jesus simply answered, "You would have no power over me unless it had been given you from above." In other words, the real power here, the true source of power, is God, and only God. Everyone else, both the religious leaders and Pilate himself, are really the ones who are powerless here. That is to say that none of this would have happened if God had not allowed it to happen. Because if God had not wanted it to happen, don't you think that God could have and would have intervened? Actually, as it turns out, God would ultimately intervene on Jesus' behalf and even tip the scales in Jesus' favor, but not until after he had already been put to death. Now, spoiler alert here, we're not there yet, but I think there's an empty tomb still to come in the story, just saying. However, I think that there's another perhaps bigger question still to consider. If it can be said that it certainly appears that God allowed the crucifixion to happen, can we also say then that God actually willed it to happen? That it actually was God's plan all along? Many, of course, would say yes, just as they would similarly say that everything else that happens in this life and in the world are part of God's plan and therefore represent God's will. Well, I don't know about you, but that line of thought has always bothered me. It's God's will, really. Everything that happens, including and especially the bad things that happen, it's because God willed for them to happen. The late Maurice Moe White was a Lutheran pastor who served in Massillon, Ohio. And during Lent one year, an elderly member of his congregation fell down the steps while leaving their midweek service and broke her hip. Unfortunately, and for some unknown reason, she did not recover from the subsequent hip surgery, and she died a few days later. Well, Pastor White stood by the casket with the bereaved husband the night before her funeral, and many people came to pay their respects and to offer their condolences, of course. But a number of well-meaning friends kept saying to this grieving husband things like, "God must have a plan for this, so we'll just have to accept it." Others said it was God's will, and we have to live with it. Still others said somehow God planned this to test your faith. And still others said there's a silver lining in every cloud. You'll find God's reason behind this eventually. Well, Pastor White left the funeral home that night very angry at what he called the babbling that he had heard that evening. And so he went directly to his study and he rewrote the opening of his funeral sermon. And the next morning he opened his sermon with the words, "My God does not push old ladies down church steps." He then proceeded to explain that God cannot be blamed for all the brokenness in this world. If God is the author of death, he said, how can he be at the same time the author of life, as shown through the resurrection of Jesus Christ that we celebrate each and every Sunday, and especially on Easter? Is God the God of the living or the God of the dead? He asked them point blank. Can't have it both ways, he told his congregation. And if God is not a God who pushes old ladies down the church steps, then neither, I would argue, is God a God who intentionally planned that Jesus would die such a hideous and painful death on the cross. Even though God was the one ultimately in control, I do not believe that God planned for Jesus to be put to death. Here's what I do think happened, however. One of the classic stories in Scripture, one of my all-time favorite Bible passages as well, has to do with the final showdown between Joseph and his brothers at the very end of the book of Genesis. I've talked about this before, but it bears repeating. A story in Genesis that's been running now for some 14 chapters has finally come to its climax. And if you remember, Joseph had the good fortune, or perhaps the misfortune, of being his father Jacob's favorite son. And in response, his older brothers grew increasingly jealous and resentful of him, and eventually did the unthinkable. They sold him into slavery. And they took his coat and covered it in goat's blood, and then showed it to their father, who naturally assumed that Joseph had been devoured by a wild beast. Clearly, his brothers were guilty of an evil and sinful act, and they were solely to blame, not God. But here's the thing. God had a response to that evil. That is, it did not go unanswered. Joseph, of course, ended up a slave in Egypt, but because of his God-given ability to interpret dreams, he rose all the way up to a position of some power and prominence in the Pharaoh's government. And later in that position, because he was able to successfully interpret one of Pharaoh's own dreams, Joseph was able to store grain during the years of plenty, and so to prepare for the famine, which then immediately followed afterwards. And because of those preparations, many lives were saved, including those of his own family. In other words, Joseph's brothers did a bad thing, evil thing, but in response, God was able to turn the situation completely around and bring some good out of it. In fact, that's precisely what Joseph told his brothers, who were fearful that he would at long last try to exact some measure of revenge. However, the NRSV translation obscures this a little bit. It reads, "Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today." The wording, you see, is ambiguous enough that it's kind of hard to tell exactly who intended what. A better rendering, perhaps, is found in the Good News translation, which reads, "You plotted evil against me, but God turned it into good." Or the New Living Translation, which has, "As far as I'm concerned, God turned the good into good what you meant for evil." And the Message puts it this way, "Don't you see, you planned evil against me, but God used those same plans for my good, as you see all around you right now, life for many people." In other words, Joseph's brothers did an evil thing, which in turn created the circumstances out of which God nevertheless brought something good. Well, I think we have the same thing, the very same thing going on here with Jesus' death on the cross. As much as Pilate will be held accountable for ordering Jesus' crucifixion, as Jesus said in our reading, "The one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." You see, both Pilate and the religious leaders exercised their will, their free will, to see to it that Jesus was put to death. It wasn't God's doing, it was theirs. It wasn't God's will, it was theirs. But on the cross, God took what was evil and turned it into good. God turned into good what was meant for evil. The religious leaders planned evil against Jesus, but God used those same plans, those very same plans, for good, as we can see all around us right now, life for many people. In other words, the religious leaders, along with the help of Pilate, did an evil thing out of which God nevertheless brought something good. And what was it that God did in response? God intervened and tipped the scales in our favor, and something good, very good, came out of it. Something so good that has changed the trajectory of our lives and our world forever. Amen. Have a great day and a great rest of your week. See you next week. Till then, take care. Bye.